that connection in the brain and the social stimulation that social connection gives you literally keeps your brain healthy.
Welcome to Evolving Ageless. This is the Evolving Woman's Antidote to Aging. And I am your host, Michelle Dreilich. I'm here every week with experts in their fields, bringing us more information and the latest research on their experiences to help us live ageless. In fact, I am on a mission to change the way women age. And my guest today is going to help us do just that. I have known Dr. Kara Parker for a few years now, and I have to say, she is absolutely forever ageless and always brilliant. So welcome, Dr. Parker. It's so good to see you.
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Oh, it's wonderful. So Dr. Kara Parker, you might recognize her from Ageless Transformations Health Reset Challenge. She's one of our faculty and one of our esteemed educators. And she, I find, brings such a balanced wisdom to everything I've ever spoken with her about, both clinically, socially, really just has a wonderful perspective on life. And I just couldn't wait to share your perspectives with our audience. So Dr. Parker is board certified in family medicine. She's also certified in functional medicine and boarded in integrative medicine. So she absolutely, in all of her training and education, always looks for the root cause, always works with patients to dive deeper at identifying actually what the underlying challenges are that's causing any symptoms or presentation. She's trained physicians and residents in her methods. She's really known for her work in battlefield ear acupuncture. She's also trained in acupuncture.
Yeah.
And I think we should talk about that a little today as we talk about today's topic. So have you ever noticed that there are times in your life where maybe you feel more isolated from your peers or your social setting, your typical environment, whether it's work, home? That isolation, it can drain us, right? And it can have a profound impact on the way we think about our lives. But it's deeper than that. And that's why I'm excited for Dr. Parker and I. We're going to talk about isolation, loneliness versus being alone. And I really want to start off, Dr. Parker, tell us about how this is an epidemic, how deep this really is, because I know we brush this off like, well, I'm just a little down, but let's really dig into it.
Yeah, thank you. So my functional medicine training makes me take a look at what are some of the root causes of illness. And social isolation and the experience of loneliness is just a huge elephant in the room, even before we all got put into isolation together as an entire globe with COVID-19. It is as big a statistic as some of our common chronic health issues. We'll get into that a little bit. But it still is so stigmatized as something we're not supposed to be experiencing, or it's our fault, or if we just. And I think that's really a block for us to address it properly, to acknowledge that it's there and then to address it. So, the topic of loneliness and social isolation was impacting 1/3 to 1/2 of people in the United States. When they looked at a study of 46 different studies and then another 23 different studies, they found that between 22% and 46% of people experience loneliness a great percentage of the time. And what is an epidemic? We're calling COVID an epidemic, and it's hit about 1% of us in the United States. 1%. What is it called when half of people experience this commonly? And when the experience is so impactful to our health, it's something that we really need to wake up, uproot, acknowledge, and address. So that's what we're going to dig into today.
I love it. And so what are some of the signs that someone is being affected by isolation? Because not everyone recognizes that this situation that they're in, or maybe they've always been somewhat isolated. They may not recognize what these signs are.
Yeah, you raise a really good point that you can be a person who has 30 contacts a day, a large, rich network of people, and is always out and about and have a perceived experience of loneliness. And just the same, you can be a person living in deep Alaska and seeing someone once a year and not experience loneliness at all. So this is the range. Loneliness isn't a vital sign that we can take. There's not a blood lab for it. It really is a thought construct that is so powerful. It leads to really incredible physiology in our body, and increases health indicators. So it really is upon us to understand what that thought construct of loneliness is. It boils down to the experience that you don't belong, that you are alone and isolated. So you could be with a vibrant working group and have employment you love and have a wide family that lives right with you and see friends and be on sports teams and belong to a church group and still experience a mismatch in your needs for feeling like you belong and having deep relationships with others where you feel like you are seen, acknowledged, and accepted to the degree that you do that for others.
Wow.
On the other hand,
would you say that that's part of why we don't take it seriously in society? Because it seems hard to pin down, right? Or that
yes.
our parents or our grandparents would say, "Oh, toughen up." These are one of those things that is insidious right in front of us.
Yeah, you have the perfect life. It looks like you do. Why are you experiencing this? And on the other hand, you moved away to college. You now are not connected to that core group of high school friends, or you just became a new mom and are no longer working, or you've moved, or whatever it is. Sure, that happens to all of us. So I think we just expect people to sort of get over it. And I can't know what your inner life experience is. I can look at your life, at your social media, at your accomplishments, at whatever, and say, you've got it all together. But your inner experience of how you may feel lonely and disconnected and have a mismatch between what your needs and expectations are, only you can know that. And so it takes some real self-honesty, first of all. You and I talked about, well, what about introversion, extroversion? And you might think that the extroverts right now with this enforced social isolation of COVID are having a terrible time. That could be true. It really is about how much our expectations and our needs about belonging are being shifted. And so there is a dual thing going on with this epidemic of loneliness that already existed. Certainly it's increased. It is just increased because our social structures that sustain us have really been taken from us. But for some people, some of my most lonely patients, those experiencing chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, who are very isolated from before, some of them say, I feel less lonely now. I don't have any more social contacts. But because all of a sudden everyone is experiencing what I've experienced for a decade and nobody attended to me, nobody understood, now a lot more people understand what I'm going through. And that actually, even though they're just as socially isolated, it helps their expectation or their mismatch a little bit, right?
Yeah, especially I think, and I can see this being, it affects men and women, no doubt. But I can see women are much, tend to be more feely, emotion oriented. And,
Yeah.
I have to be honest, when you're looking at someone else's A-roll on social media, right?
Mm.
And you're
Yeah.
living every experience in your life, you see the disconnect.
Yes.
And in the right situation, it can help, it can assist someone in further withdrawal. I can
Yeah.
completely see how that happens.
It just plays into that mismatch that everyone else is experiencing this greatness. Oh, look at what they're doing with their kids during isolation, and what have I done with mine? That kind of thing. On the other hand, it is also an opportunity to link to people you haven't linked to before and to seek that community that does understand you. You know, that same person I was talking about who may have had fibromyalgia and be totally isolated, they don't have connections with their family. They don't have connections with a job anymore. But all of a sudden now there is a Facebook group of people that understand them, and that helps their loneliness. So
Mm.
it's not black and white, and there's not all one response, but it's up to each of us to understand, to be educated on what loneliness is, what it does, and what we can do. You know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when you called it an emotional construct, it's so clear now. It's not about being sequestered. It's not
Right.
about being physically alone.
Yep.
It's an emotional construct. So
Yep.
then let's talk about
Yep.
what the difference is between loneliness and being alone and that
Mm,
solitude.
yeah. It really is about how you're using and experiencing the time. So, being a very busy person and choosing to take a weekend to meditate, take a break, and have solitude to refresh and restore and re engage in the connections,
Mhm.
experiencing oneness with nature, oneness with self, oneness with purpose, oneness with mission. You can be completely alone and have no contact with others and feel deeply connected. And so that's the difference. It's not about who's around you and how many gatherings do you have. It's about your experience with it, your expectations for it, and what is happening inside around that. You might be interested to know that there is a loneliness gene. They've actually identified a gene that makes the experience of loneliness about 20% inherited. And so there are people who, no matter what through life, no matter who they're connected to and what happens, always experience a profound mismatch in their needs for social connection and what their experience is. And as with all things genetic, there are many things that can bolster and protect you from the worst of that depth of experience. Of course, what is that? It's your lifestyle. It's all the things that we're taught to do with making sure you exercise enough, making sure you sleep deeply,
Mm.
getting out and connecting, faking it till you make it with that experience. And then there's a whole bunch of nutritive needs that make it so you're less inflamed and less likely to transcribe this experience of loneliness. All
Oh.
of us have some degree or another on the spectrum of a native vibe of the experience of loneliness. It's a human condition. We all have it. None of us will escape it in periods. And then some of us experience it almost all the time and have to crawl our way out of this experience by buffering ourselves. So,
Wow. And I can see, since we've been in this self isolation period of time, and I know the world is opening in different places. I know you're in Minnesota. You're going to be the last place that opens,
yeah,
probably.
yeah.
But, what an amazing, I think we've all stepped back in awe of nature, right? During these past few months at how absolutely
Mm,
glorious and the constant regeneration and healing that can happen in
yeah,
nature, right? Just looking out of my own backyard, I see
yeah,
significantly more wildlife, more green popping up everywhere. The skies have taken on a blue like we've never seen. It's
yes.
just been remarkable. And so I love when you say, get out there, take your shoes off, right?
Mm,
Put your feet on the dirt and just feel your connection to something much bigger than who you're sitting with at work or who you're
yes.
zooming with in the office.
Absolutely. This time is a real quietness. It's a real it's a forced introspection, really, to take stock. And then, if we're lucky enough to have enough of our needs met, it's really hard to have a global experience of oneness and to be open and receive this connection of nature when you're not sure where your next paycheck is coming from. There's a lot
Right.
of difficulty that goes on right now, so not to ignore that. But we have collectively been given a gift of quietness and shutdown that if we choose to open up a bit and look around, as you're saying, Michelle, you can experience some of that inner oneness, inner quietness. It's also a time to reassess when you don't have to be quite as busy about the day-to-day distractions. By force nature, you're not traveling as much. I'm not traveling as much. I'm doing conferences after having breakfast with my family, taking my dogs for a walk and shooing them down the stairs. And here I am in an experience that I normally might have traveled to. That collapse is really an openness for me to say, who am I? And what is my authentic self? What is my true nature? Because I don't have to play the game quite as much right now for what normally would be expected and demanded of me in my life. And shifting the experience of loneliness first comes with connecting to ourselves, honoring ourselves, so that from that place, we can then connect to others. That makes sense.
Yes, that makes complete sense, right?
Yeah.
It's that I'm not worthy talk, that
Yes.
self-worth discussion that we have. More and more, we find ourselves in this materialistic place. And I think that really is the recipe for kicking off a
Yeah.
lot of that self-doubt and insecurity. And as you said, the right perfect storm is that self-talk drives me deeper and deeper and deeper into isolation, right?
I'm glad you mentioned materialism when you asked the question, what does an experience of loneliness look like? Interestingly, one of the first things that is called out in that experience is an over focus on material goods. So you kind of plunge into this self world of, do I have the right things? Making material things over human connections. And it can really be a spiral. It's not just keeping up with the Joneses. It's, since I don't have social connection, let me just make sure I at least have the right clothes, the right perfect things for this birthday party for my kids. Instead of like, forget all that. Let's just gather. Let's just be together. So I wanted to also talk about as we're discovering that, self-acceptance, self-rejection almost is the first place it starts. But the experience of rejection, they, in the past several years, have really started to study the genetics and the gene transcribing of a variety of things. And one of the most inflammatory things our bodies can experience, and you think about inflammation, oh, I know I need to eat an anti-inflammatory diet. I know I need to take certain supplements. I know I need to stay away from certain poisons that are very pro-inflammatory, right? High fructose corn syrup, trans fats, heavy metals, pesticides, you name it. We know that that is going to go right down to the gene level and transcribe inflammation. But guess what? One of the most inflammatory transcriptors is the experience of being rejected, whatever that means for you. So you could be a person experiencing divorce, and it's something that you've wanted for years, and you're so glad the time has finally come, and you're taking steps for yourself and empowering yourself, and it's the best thing that happened to you. Or you could be experiencing someone that you loved and wanted to be with rejecting you over and over and over again. And that experience of rejection is going to go right to your DNA and transcribe inflammation. You could have the perfect diet, sleep as deeply as you can, exercise every day, and do everything right, and have a profound transcription of inflammation because of the experience of rejection. It's the worst in teens, as you might imagine. Teens are very highly programmed to want to belong, to figure out their place in the world. and to be really, really inflamed and flattened by rejection. And so in the deepest experience of lack of belonging and social isolation, of rejection, you're 20 times more likely to become depressed or to worsen underlying depression you already had. 20 times. We don't have, there's nothing else that competes with that. And I think I wasn't taught that statistic that is well known. As I went through med school, I wasn't taught that in residency. I had to dig deep to find that. IFM actually brought this to the forefront with some of the lead researchers several years ago in their annual international conference. And after that, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Here we're trying to apply all these right chemical things and do all these right activities. And what if part of us just needs to drop and be honest of like, where do I experience rejection in my life? Self or other? And what can I do about that to buffer that? Because it's worse than anything else. I might as well go eat a Big Mac and drink a Coke if I'm not going to address rejection.
That is the scariest thought. I have to be honest, what you're saying, right? First of all, let's take it back just a few steps and say it's transcribing on your DNA. Like you are affecting. So just to be clear with the audience, right? Because this is a deep, heavy thing we're talking about here. How emotions and feelings, because we know that they're chemical, it's biochemical, right? Emotions are not just these things that wash over us, they are chemicals that wash through us. And that actually impacts the way our DNA, when it's replicating, that feeling of rejection can replicate itself every time your cells divide.
It turns on our genes that create enzymes that create inflammation versus buffer it. So what's a buffer? So deep social connection, a feeling of belonging, a feeling of transcendence, gratitude. All these positive emotions are just the opposite. But we need to really be honest about what the experience of rejection does. And then maybe we think twice, what is bullying in school? What is cyberbullying? It's more than just oh, that's terrible, you shouldn't do that. It actually,
kids, right? That's
yes.
People say kids will be kids.
You would never let a kid throw a punch at another kid. Throwing a punch is actually less inflammatory in transcribing genetics for inflammation than is the experience of rejection. So let's just sit with that for a minute. It truly is a chemical soup of harm.
It seems to me that women in their 40s, 50s, 60s are quite vulnerable in this space, even though I'm understanding it's affecting everyone. But
yes, you're right. And interestingly, Harvard team did a study on this, an 80-year longitudinal study. They're in their 80th something year now.
Wow.
And what they found, this will lead us into talking about the health risks of loneliness. What they found was the biggest factor in people's, whether they lived well and died at a ripe old age while being healthy or died early. Guess what was the biggest factor about that, Michelle? You might think.
I would always say nutrition. So
yeah, me too. Without a doubt, me too. How well did they eat? Over all those lifetimes, how many forkfuls of anti-inflammatory food did they put down?
Right.
That ranks. It does rank. Whether they smoked or not, whether they drank alcohol and how much or not, that ranked. But the biggest factor by far, not even by a little bit, but by far, was how satisfied in their 50s they were with their social connections. So you're talking about this conversion period of kids and activities, if you have children, and then the kids moving out and all that. And what happens is, oh my gosh, you're left with somewhat of a vacuum. No matter who you are and what you do, there's a transition and a vacuum. Turning 50 is a transition and a vacuum anyway, health-wise in every way, right? Sometimes careers change. It's oftentimes a period of great transformation. And the degree to which a person had a social buffer of people they felt close to and were satisfied, it didn't matter how many people they rated as being in their life. It was how satisfied they were with those connections. That was the greatest indicator of how well and how long they lived versus died early. Isn't
That's
that
amazing.
interesting?
That's
Mhm.
the Blue Zones, right? The book, The
Yes,
Blue
it
Zones. If
is.
you haven't read The
Yes,
Blue
it
Zones,
is.
it is a very quick read, but profound in terms of what we know about longevity from the impact of socialization and many
You're
other
right.
factors, but especially your network and your connection to your network.
Yep. Beyond whether you ate a Mediterranean diet and how vegetarian it was and how much fish you had and how out in the sun you were, it was really those early life social connections that persisted through life where people never really had to even worry about that. They just had outside of their family, an a work of people who were there for them no matter what. Um, so as we're talking about impact on mortality and what has a great risk, it's really stunning to me that we as a medical society have not figured out how to gather around this and how to work on it. So, somebody smoking 15 cigarettes or more a day, what would you say about their mortality? All of us would
Yeah,
say
absolutely.
absolutely increased, right? So it turns out your mortality is you're 1.5 times more likely if you smoke 15 cigarettes a day to die early of bad things. Your
Yep.
mortality increases by 1.5 times. Um, if you're sedentary, the definition of sedentary being that you literally get less than a half an hour of movement a day. And I'm sad to say that that's about 40% of Americans have that kind of sedentary life, like barely get up out of the chair, off the couch. That confers about a 1.3 times risk of early death and mortality. And all the research screams about these things, smoking and sedentary life, as being so significant, so increasing of our death and our death from bad things. So isolation and the perception, the chronic pervasive perception of loneliness and low social support is a 1.67 times increase in death. It is above smoking, it's above sedentary life, it's even above diabetes. And think of all the focus our society puts on that.
Wow.
So where are we at in really honestly addressing this, looking at it? Other things, if you are lonely and have a low social network, you have a 25% increased risk in dying from cancer.
Mhm.
And they've done studies on sleep in loneliness and found that people who experience loneliness, so let's say at times you're more socially connected, you're feeling better about your life, you're feeling better about your experiences with others, you sleep better. And when that shifts to an experience of loneliness because you've moved, because of whatever factors, you have many more awakenings and less deeply refreshing sleep. So
Mm.
now we've talked about transcribing inflammatory DNA. Now we're talking about less refreshing sleep. And we know, what does less refreshing sleep give you? A whole host of things, right?
Right.
Yeah, you don't restore for women pre, peri, and post menopause. You make hormones in the depth of sleep. And so if you're not getting into those deeper stages of sleep and you're waking more early, there's going to be less time for your mitochondria to be working on those hormones and restoring and rebalancing them. Fighting infection. This is a real concern in the time of COVID. We say, let's wait for a vaccine, and maybe there's going to be some wonder drugs that are going to improve our experience, our mortality from COVID. Well, sleeping it improves our mortality from COVID because it resets your immune system. It allows things to calm down and your white blood cells to restore and get ready to fight the next day. So it's really, really important. Loneliness, the Alzheimer's statistic is actually quite striking. It's the worst of all of them. Well, I talked about the 20 times increase in depression with rejection, but the experience of loneliness with Alzheimer's, you have a 4 times increased risk of getting Alzheimer's and dying from Alzheimer's than if you are not experiencing loneliness and social isolation. So why would that be? Because that connection in the brain and the social stimulation that social connection gives you literally keeps your brain healthy.
Right. They
Right?
fire and wire, right?
That's
Yep.
right. Yep, that's right. So
Well,
really,
and layer in the inflammatory transcription that you talked about, right? Because
Mhm.
we know things like diabetes, things like Alzheimer's, depression, these are all conditions of inflammation.
Yeah,
They start with in a
yeah,
hyperinflamed state. So it just seems like it's layers and layers
yes.
of confounding issues that all kind of point back to this idea of loneliness and isolation.
Yeah. The research on our brains in a resting state, if you think about it, think about humanity throughout the ages. Why would we be programmed to need to connect? So loneliness is really a barometer saying there's a little danger here. If your leg was bleeding, you'd say there's danger here. I need to help my leg, or I could die of a bad infection. I could bleed out. You get help for that.
Mhm.
But the sense and the internal experience of loneliness is just as big a warning sign that we've learned to ignore and blame ourselves for and keep quiet and be embarrassed about. But it is there to serve us to reconnect. Why would it be there? Well, if you live back, way back in the day, your survival depended upon your links with others. So humans, if you think about a baby developing, we have to take care of our young way past other species. Other species, like, the foal is born and it stands up immediately. It doesn't need a year to learn to walk. And it learns how to feed itself nearly immediately. And it's weaned from its mother very quickly, and off it goes. Not so with humans. So we really need a ring around us to protect all the layers of our society so we can survive as a species. So our native state of comfort and sense of well-being is a connected state. And when brain researchers looked at um, when are you in a state of distraction, what is that like? A state of distraction of doing things is oftentimes, but not always, a state where the place in your brain that fires with social connection is no longer firing. So distracted. And I would include a lot of our social media. You can be in a state of sending a text to someone trying to connect, be distracted and not fully present. And you are not firing the connection from your brain. You're not building on that and giving your brain that deep experience of connection.
Mm.
When you're in a state of creativity or flow where you're not with other people, you are also firing the place in your brain about social connection and dampening the experience of loneliness. So the native resting state of the body is one that is connected. It's thinking about connections, it's reaching for connections, it's creating about connections and for connections. And when you're in that connective state, whether with people and interacting with them or with yourself and not directly interacting, the more you're firing the connected place in your brain, the more your vagus nerve is in a state of calm and parasympathetic forward or relaxed state forward. So the more connected, the more relaxed we are. The
And
more
this is the connection between purpose that you're
yeah,
speaking of, right?
that's
So when
right.
you have this sense of purpose or engaging in when we talk about meditation, but even things like tending your garden,
Yeah.
even things like creating art, um, knitting, crocheting, things that put you in that fulfilled place
Mm-hmm.
seem to override that isolation and that's
They,
amazing.
what your brain is doing when you're in the flow, if you're in a flow moment,
Yeah.
it is also quietly and unconsciously connecting you to other people. What about knitting this for a friend? What am I creating this art for? How about in the community? You may be thinking you're having a solo experience. And this is really, it's profound. It's where self-care is not selfish. Self-care is not selfish. Creativity is not selfish. Taking time for oneself in that, if you reach that flow state in the state of relaxation, you are natively energetically and in brain form in heart rhythm, connected to others, even when they're not present with you. So then shift that to be with others in that deeply creative state. And that's magical. Then you really are on lots of levels experiencing that, right?
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
let's transition, because I think this is what we're talking about now is,
Yeah.
what do you do about this?
Yeah.
This feeling, and you mentioned it's a spiral, it's self-perpetuating. When you start withdrawing, we've likely have all felt this. As you start withdrawing, you start to find more and more reasons why it's good that you're withdrawing. It's better that you're not a part of it.
Yeah.
How do we snap out of that? What is your best advice on that?
I think really just being honest with ourselves. It takes a real honest assessment. So taking an inventory. How satisfied am I right now with my relationships? It's okay if you're not satisfied. It's okay if you should be satisfied. But if you're truly not, that is something to just be honest about. I think this pause in everything that's going on around us, we're having to be honest about racial disparities, racism, equity, all kinds of things. It's also a time to take this inventory now more than ever and say, all right, who's in my inner ring? So who's in my very inner ring? The people that I confide in, the people I can have the deepest conversation with, share meaning and purpose in my life. That may be the people you live with. And if it is, you're very lucky. And the cultivation of that is extremely important. That may be relationships and connections you've made with others that you deeply confide in, that are there for you on a regular basis. So that inner circle is those touch points that are regular and deep and connecting. And if you take a look at that, we do this in group visits. We actually have people map out these rings I'm going to describe. And there are people crying in the room. It's a very vulnerable moment to draw these things in your circle and to realize right now it's fairly empty, or it used to be, but I'm not accessing it very well right now. Or I wish it was. That's just an honest assessment. So draw a circle on paper. Who's in that innermost ring? Another circle around it is people you feel affection and friendliness towards, but for whatever factors, could be geography, could be time, could be whatever. You just don't have regular interactions with them. But when you do connect, it's deep. It's great. You have friendliness. And then in the outer ring is your professional life. It's those people for whom you are connecting with and to, but they're not the people you're going to have the deepest of conversations on a regular basis. They're not the people you're going to call at 3 a.m. when you have a flat tire. And to that point, I would also say there's a lot of good social connection scales to fill out. So they exist, and they include questions, just as I just mentioned. If I was stuck and my car broke down 10 miles from home, are there 3 people I could immediately call that I would be guaranteed, unless it's people are on vacation or something, they would come? And do I have people I can count on to come get me? It's amazing how many people answer, gosh, I'm highly connected, but I don't have that person. I don't have that person that I could call on in a moment of need that within an hour would be there for me. And that speaks to the busyness of our society. Societies long ago who were all together would have that. They'd be right sitting next to them. You wouldn't even have to pick up your cell phone.
The whole community would come, right?
The whole community would come. Yeah,
right.
That's right. So that honest assessment, that taking a look at not just who's there for you, but the most important part of loneliness that gets to how inflamed you're going to be, and what your health risks are, is how satisfied you are with these. It doesn't matter if you think it's right or wrong about that. It doesn't matter if you think you should be satisfied about that. It's just an honest, am I? Do I experience satisfaction?
But I love your off the cuff, like, who would you call at 3 a.m.?
Yeah.
That gives you pause, and it gives you a moment to reflect on maybe those folks that are not quite in the inner circle, but the outer ring that you're deeply connected to. Maybe it's time to work on forging more connectivity, more
Right.
frequent connectivity, right?
Yep.
Start
So
pulling them in closer.
So how do you do that? There's then this added barrier of we should know how to make friends. We've been alive as long as we have on this earth. And if only it was that intuitive and easy. It's not. And it's increasingly difficult in our society that is siloed and that projects this pretense of who we should be and how the things that we should be living up to. So you mentioned earlier also, Michelle, just these silos of, could be political affiliation, it could be religious beliefs, it could be your career type. There's many different things. It could be what your kids do as activities that put you in certain silos. And how do we make friends? It turns out, as I several years ago looked at how to do a group visit on social connection, and was floored that I thought stress, sleep, diet, exercise were going to be the most important group visits, and this was going to be a little fluff at the end. And then I looked at the statistics we talked about and went, this isn't fluff at the end. This is actually the parachute that holds everything up. So all the lifestyle is held up by social connection. It's supported. So it turns out there are entire psychological societies and there's information in the literature built on how do you make and keep friends? How do you narrow the gap between your expectations and needs and your satisfaction with the connections you have? And one of the most important things, well, we touched on first, is it's got to be self-knowledge and acceptance. If you're living a life that is trying to match up to other people's standards and isn't authentic to you, you cannot, it's very hard to have authentic relationship with others. So who are you by your true nature? What is it that makes you tick? What is your purpose in life? And from that place, living in that space, is the place from which you then suspend that self and deeply listen to others. So with the security of self, this sounds, I don't mean to dismiss how not easy this is, but just be with me for a minute here. With kind of the depth of security and love and compassion for self, you can then say, I'm good here. Let me just set myself aside and let's get curious about someone else. So it's a place of deep listening, like really deep, authentic listening, not interruption, just curiosity. And one of the best ways to make a link with someone else that could be a friend is, first of all, you have an inkling that you want to. You know, it's hard to do with someone that truly your sensors are going off saying no. But if there is that warmth of inkling, your self says, I like this person. Doesn't matter who they are or where they're from. I'm curious. I kind of like to get to know them. Then it takes being quiet and listening, and then asking more questions than you talk. And seeing, then you throw that out there in a vulnerable way. And then you see what comes back to me. Does a similar curiosity toward me and who I am come back? And is that curiosity about who I am authentically? Does it want honest answers? Is it really asking? Or is it hoping that I'm going to live up to whatever their expectations and needs are? Do I have to play a game? Do I have to live up to something? Or do I feel like I can say anything that's true for me right now and I'm experiencing, and it will be accepted by the other? So it's a vulnerable two-way street. You know, you can't, you can throw it out there and you can listen and you can be railroaded by someone who has so many needs that they just want to talk and there's not a connection. That's not a true friendship. But there are many people from many walks of life that you may not ever think you would normally connect to who can be in that space for you and who can fill that role. And so it takes a little bit of a leap of faith. It takes a leap of trust. And then it takes that curiosity and questioning and deep listening.
And going back to your comment about rejection, putting that off to the side, right? Because thinking of it, almost spinning it for the positive, like if this curiosity is not two-sided, that's okay.
Yeah.
Because that means it was not right.
Yeah,
it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's not that you're being rejected by this other. You're just both two people. It's just
Right.
not the right connection. So it's time to have
Yeah.
another connection, you know?
Right.
And rejection comes from a much different place than acknowledging you're both just two people that it didn't click, right?
Hmm.
Rejection comes from feeling like that person is you're maybe beneath that person or you're different than that person or you don't belong in that situation. That's very negative against yourself.
Hmm.
So this is just these two people didn't connect. Let's move on to the next one. So
Interesting, though, I want to add an important thing that because we don't identify loneliness in ourselves or others well, so when they do this experimentally and they stick a person who's feeling fine, not anxious, not depressed, not feeling lonely, in a room with a lonely person, what they experience is someone who is rejecting them, doesn't want
yes,
to be with them,
yes.
doesn't want to connect with them, is anxious or depressed. And it's like, why would I try to connect with that person? When truly that person's in a cycle of loneliness, not intentional. They're not trying to throw barbs at you. It comes from the closed nature of not being in a space to be curious, not feeling good about oneself. And we don't realize that sometimes an intervention is needed to say, hey, you're a person I care about. And normally I would be connecting with. I'm not experiencing that right now. I am going to withhold the worry that that's because of me and it's my fault. Are you okay? Are you
Oh,
feeling lonely? Is there anything I can do because I care about you? Sometimes that can pop a bubble and help people realize, like, thank you for saying something. I didn't realize you even got that from me. I didn't realize I was doing it. And, so yeah.
I love that. Why don't we make that part of our little homework here? I
Mm,
love this idea of, it takes a village and as you mentioned with the statistics between 22 and 46% of people that are experiencing this on a daily basis, that means if it's not me, it's someone around me.
yeah, that's
So
true.
either if it's me, I'm going to start working on shifting my mindset and talking about all these things we discussed today about putting myself out there in a way where I'm not vulnerable,
Mm,
but I'm curious
yeah,
and playful that way. Likewise, if it's not me, I'm going to lift someone else up.
that's,
I'm going to find someone in my inner circle. We all have plenty of people in our inner circle
mm,
that are feeling like this.
yeah. And our brains do not know the difference whether we're experiencing a state of connection or we're bringing someone else into that state. And so our brains light up the same way, whether we are feeling reconnected for the first time and acknowledged and deeply seen authentically for who we are by another, or we're doing the outreach to someone else. And so I would say to that, if we think about in this time of isolation, our elders who already were isolated, already experiencing that, is the need to bring food or do some of these cares, or is the need just to ask them questions and show up with a state of curiosity to know that they are seen, that they are known, that they are cared for, that they are important, that they exist? If you practice that, you will have the same experience in your brain and body, and you will transcribe anti-inflammatory chemicals in yourself and the other. So the benefit is just compounded with that kind of dare to outreach and dare to make a link.
Hmm.
That makes sense.
It's, I will say, Dr. Kara Parker, I promised everyone beautiful and brilliance. And I think that's what we're seeing because everything you're describing here is what our community is based on. This is
Mm,
foundational for
yeah.
how we as a society, I mean, this is advice on how to get through the next day, the next week, or how we evolve post COVID, or
Yeah.
how we what is, we always talk about the new normal. What a wonderful layer I think we all need to add to the new normal. I think
Mm,
I can't thank you enough for taking your time out of your incredibly busy day and sharing this time with us because your message is one I in case you missed it, your message is one that supersedes these are loneliness is a condition that supersedes most of our diseases.
yeah. It does.
And And we all know someone, if not ourselves, that i- are living in a profound negative state because of it. And it can
Mhm.
have long lasting health repercussions. So
That's right.
let's all heal ourselves and heal one another, at least in this sense, with these tools. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Michelle. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
I will see everyone again next week with a different topic. But for now, get on out there and let's heal together and keep on living ageless.
Great.
Bye for now.